These days, Amobi Okoye is nothing more than a footnote in NFL history, the man who is the youngest ever player to be drafted into the modern NFL. We're talking about post-merger with the AFL. At 19 years and 10 months, the teenager was the 10th overall selection in the 2000 draft taken by the Houston Texans. The potential upside of what Okoye could become as a football player was obvious. The reality, though, turned out quite different. What happened to the youngest ever player taken in the NFL draft since 1970, and was he actually 19 years old? I'm Cheyenne Hollis, this is The Touchback, and today we'll answer those questions and hopefully gain a better understanding of why age shouldn't be the end-all be-all when it comes to sports.
What's my age again? What's my age again?
Amobi Okoye didn't start playing football, well, at least the American variety, that is, until he was 12 years old and a freshman in high school. Now, I know a lot of you are wondering, how could that possibly be? Okoye's father had immigrated from Nigeria to the United States, and eventually his family would join them in Huntsville, Alabama. Upon entering the United States school system, Okoye was placed in middle school based upon his age. The thing was he had actually skipped a few grades in Nigeria and was at the high school level at that time. He, along with his family, would fight this ruling about being placed in middle school. Eventually, Okoye would test out and be put into the 9th grade, which was a better reflection of his education level at this time. In high school, Okoye would be persuaded to join the football team, learn a lot about the sport, and he developed into a Division I caliber prospect. He chose Louisville over Harvard, but the 16-year-old college freshman didn't do much in his first year with the Cardinals. In fact, he wouldn't really see playing time for Louisville until his junior year, and even then, his impact was minimal. Everything changed for Okoye as a senior when he blossomed into a disruptive defensive tackle that drew the attention of NFL scouts who were intrigued by both his on-field production as a senior for Louisville as well as his age. The hype train around Okoye really started to take off in the build-up to the 2007 NFL draft. Most mock drafts published in the build-up to the event had Okoye going within the first 10 or so picks. Really around between 5 and 10 was the typical range he was taken. Everyone was just drooling over what Okoye could become. If he was this good at 19, just imagine what he would develop by the time he reached his peak as a football player. That was the logic behind it. Okoye even got a major profile piece in ESPN the magazine written by Seth Wickersham, although it was not his finest work. One of the more telling, one of the more curious bits from this ESPN the magazine article had to be comparisons between Okoye and LeBron James, most of which came from the football player. It was a pretty ridiculous comp, especially when you considered Okoye's position as defensive tackle. It's not like we're talking about a quarterback or even a defensive end, someone who could disrupt and change the game in a way that had never been seen before. Okoye wasn't in LeBron's league. The worst part about all of this was the nickname Okoye. I don't know if he gave himself this nickname or it was bestowed upon him by someone. That was never mentioned by Wickersham, but the nickname itself is not good. Okoye had come to calling himself Phe, P-H-E, as in short for Phenom. A more apt nickname for Okoye would have been Roteline, as in short for rotational lineman. That, of course, is what he would become, but let's not get too ahead of ourselves here. The Houston Texans, a franchise who had been struggling to find serviceable defensive tackles since their inception as a franchise a few years back, selected Okoye with the 10th overall pick in the 2007 NFL draft, ahead of the likes of Darrelle Revis and Patrick Willis. It would be easy to dump on the Texans here for this, but I mean, there were a lot of teams that passed on Revis and on to prove all of those teams wrong. I'm not going to say the Texans blew it. I'm not going to give them a pass here. It just is what it is. Early on, though, it did look like Houston had made a very smart decision. In fact, his first month as a professional would be Okoye's best. He was named Defensive Rookie of the Month for September, with 4 of the 5.5 sacks he had in 2007 coming during those first 4 games. That would be Okoye's sole honor as an NFL player. Things, I don't want to say went downhill, but they just never reached that standard again during his entire career. Also during his rookie season, we should note that Okoye set basically a ton of age-related records, most of which still stand to this day. While it would be hard to categorize Okoye's rookie season as a disappointment, the next few years in his career definitely didn't quite match all of that hype he received coming out of college. He'd only have 5.5 sacks combined over his next 3 seasons with the Texans and really settled into a role as a solid rotational defensive tackle. Nothing wrong with that, by the way. It's not exactly what you hope to get back when you're taking someone with the 10th overall pick in the NFL draft, but there are far worse swings and misses we've seen over the years. Okoye was released by Houston after the 2010 season as the team was switching to a 4-3 to 3-4 defense. He would latch on with the Chicago Bears the following year, played for them, went to Tampa in 2012 during the offseason. Although he was cut by the Buccaneers before that season started, he linked back up with the Bears for the 2012 season and was released again after that. Okoye sort of disappeared in 2013, although no one really thought much of it. He was a backup defensive tackle, a rotational defensive tackle, not exactly a player who was going to draw a bunch of headlines as, why hasn't any team signed this guy? Okoye wouldn't resurface until 2014 when he signed with the Dallas Cowboys as a free agent. It is at this time when details began to emerge of exactly what had happened to him during that 2013 year. The full story was that Okoye had spent 145 days in a medically induced coma at a Houston hospital to stabilize recurring seizures he had experienced that were being caused by a major brain injury. Nearly a year after coming out of that coma, Okoye would resume football-related activities during the Dallas Cowboys 2014 training camp. He would spend the entire campaign on the Cowboys' non-football illness list before being released in 2015. He did participate in a few practices during this time, but never really came close to seeing the field as there were still some concerns about his condition. With no NFL offers forthcoming, the defensive tackle linked up with the Canadian Football League Saskatchewan Roughriders, but was again confined to a season on the injured reserve list. Okoye never did play another down of professional football in his career, but the fact that he simply got out on the practice field and was able to partake in football activities was a miracle in and of itself. As I mentioned earlier, it would be easy, and quite frankly, it would be extremely lazy to label Amobi Okoye as a bust. Yeah, he wasn't the high-producing player you would expect, but he was still a very solid defensive tackle with Houston. It's important to note 2007 was also an extremely thin defensive tackle class, with Justin Harrell, the only other one drafted in the first round, out of the league after 3 NFL seasons. There were also other defensive ends, Gaines Adams, Jamal Anderson, taken before Okoye, who were also just not able to deliver on their draft pick capital. The issue with Okoye in the NFL is that he never really developed beyond what he was as a 19-year-old prospect. Coming into the league, scouts, coaches, front office personnel, they all raved about his intangibles, his football IQ, his work ethic. Despite that, improvements never materialized for Okoye. And that brings us to the second question of this video. Was Amobi Okoye really 19 years old when drafted by the Houston Texans? In his profile piece about Okoye, Wickersham sort of glossed over the age aspect of discussions around Okoye. Yeah, it was sort of mentioned, but then it just gets dismissed as, well, Okoye had a birth certificate, so that ends that talk. In hindsight, this was a major disservice to what should have been a legitimate question. Now, we are talking about 2007 here. It would be a few years later when another Nigerian athlete age scandal would break out. In 2010, the age of Nigerian soccer players in particular became a hot button topic across the country. By that time, Okoye was a league average defensive tackle. There wasn't much of a spotlight on him. There really wasn't much of an interest in having that discussion anymore because of his sort of lot in the NFL. Had Okoye been a world beater, had he been an all-pro or Pro Bowl level player, maybe it's something that gets brought up, but it just never did because he wasn't a particularly notable football player. In the world of soccer, though, the sport was abuzz with claims that Nigerian players had continued to falsify their age. Continue, the key word to note here. This was nothing new for Nigerian soccer, really soccer as a whole in developing countries. FIFA had actually banned Nigeria from all international fixtures for 2 years after finding that the birth dates of 3 Nigerian players who participated in the 1988 Olympics were different from the ones used by the same players in previous tournaments. In other words, their birth certificates were fake and they were much older than they claimed in order to play in the Olympics, which required soccer players to be under 23. It's not a particularly well-kept secret that just about anyone in Nigeria who wants to falsify their age can do so rather easily. All you got to do is go to the immigration office, forge some documents, change your name, place of birth, date of birth, and then you just apply for a new passport and a new birth certificate under what the fake documents say. Around this time, it was also confirmed by folks connected to Nigerian soccer that a lot of players were far older than their stated ages. No number or percentage of players who had falsified their age has ever been given, but this, again, not a particularly well-kept secret in Nigeria about soccer players and their not real ages. That being said, there have been plenty of instances of this coming to light in the years that have followed. For example, 26 players from Nigeria's under-17 side failed an age test carried out ahead of an African Cup of Nations qualifier in 2016. There's one thing I want to stress here. Let me make one thing perfectly clear. There's nothing to corroborate or prove that Amobi Okoye is anything other than his stated age. It's just when you look at his development as a professional football player, his development when he made it to the NFL, it mirrors a lot of what you see with athletes in countries where the bureaucracy is not as reliable. It's not just Nigeria, by the way. I'm not just pointing them out as the only example. This happens in developing countries across the globe. In all sports, you sort of see players falsifying their ages to play at a lower level. It's just kind of the nature of the sports world. Back to Okoye, when you look at his development, it mirrors quite a bit with what you saw with Obafemi Martins. If you're not familiar with his story, Obafemi Martins was a striker who burst onto the scene with Inter Milan as a teenager. There was a lot of development in his game as a teenager. He really grew a lot between 16, 17, and 20, maybe even 21. But once Obafemi Martins became 21, the development stopped. That was his sort of peak as a player. This is in line with Amobi Okoye, who developed into basically an adult body. I mean, that is what you heard a lot from NFL scouts, is he had a senior's body by the time he was 19. And then that just sort of stopped. That development, that growth stopped. Martins had what could best be described as a very solid playing career, but he never quite developed into the striker everyone thought he was going to be when he burst on the scene as a teenager. His career was also plagued by age accusations, which were not helped by the fact the Nigerian Football Association actually listed him as being 7 years older than he really was, or at least claimed to be. The difference between Martins and really anyone connected with the Nigerian soccer age scandal and Amobi Okoye is that there's really no motivation for Okoye and his family to misrepresent his age. It's not like he was coming to America as this athlete prodigy. He was just another student and he happened to find football. Apart from being in a country where it was so easy for one to falsify his or her age, the only other suspicion a person could have when it comes to Okoye is based on his development as an athlete, as a football player. It is possible for athletes to max out at 20 years old. Everyone develops differently. There's no right or wrong way to this. It just presents a very interesting question, I think, as it relates to age entirely. Is it really a trustworthy metric, regardless of if we know true age or not? Is age really a valuable metric when analyzing a potential prospect in any sport? The hype around Okoye when he was coming into the NFL had almost nothing to do with what he was as a football player at that time, but what he could have been based on age. Had Okoye been like 23 or 24 coming out of Louisville, he's still a day 3 pick. Like, he's still going to make the NFL. He had NFL talent. Yet it wasn't the talent that made him a top 10 prospect. It wasn't the talent he had or he possessed that made him so desirable by NFL teams. It was the age, which, I mean, who really knows? You know, regardless of if he was 19, 24, you don't really know. You can't really predict human development, though, at any age. We've seen late bloomers, we've seen early bloomers, we've seen falsified age. It's such a messy question mark and one with no discernible answer as far as how something is going to go. To value age, to value what could be because this player is this age, it seems like a fool's errand. Like, you should draft on talent and things you know about, not what could be hypothetically. By the way, Okoye is still an absolutely remarkable story regardless of age. 19, 23, doesn't matter. A Nigerian immigrant who came to the United States, assimilated to the culture, learned a sport within a few years and became a professional level prospect is absolutely incredible and something that should be celebrated. Not to mention overcoming his brain disease, which is, again, even more incredible when you actually sit down and think about it. There you have it, the impressive story of what happened to the youngest player to have ever been drafted in the modern NFL. Was he really 19? It doesn't really matter at the end of the day. And despite what others will claim, he definitely wasn't a bust, no matter how you want to metric it out. Thank you for watching this video. If you'd like to know a little bit more about the Seattle Seahawks' last game ever in the Kingdom, well, you can check out the video in the upper right hand corner of your screen, or there's more NFL related content in the playlist right there, bottom right. That does it for me. I am Cheyenne Hollis. This is The Touchback, and as always, hashtag take it out to the 25.